Okay, so I am going to talk about the Yalta Conference, the Potsdam Conference, and the Paris Peace Treaties and what happened in them. So, starting with the Yalta Conference. It took place in February 1945. Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt participated. They discussed the finalizing of war in Europe and Asia. They laid foundations for future peace. They discussed German future and Poland. It is said to be the last of the wartime conferences and the first of the post-war summits. The decisions taken were very vague and could therefore be interpreted differently by the USSR and the Western Allies. So Stalin could easily manipulate these decisions, and for example, such a simple thing as democracy could mean very different things to the two. So for the Western powers, the US and Britain, it meant domination of non-communist parties, but for the USSR, it meant domination of a communist party. So what was agreed upon? They decided that Germany and Berlin should be divided into 4 parts, which you can see here. One Soviet part, one British, a British part, a French part, and a American part. And also Berlin, as you can see here, is being divided. The United Nations was to be established. Elections were to be held as soon as possible in Poland. The Polish border should run along the Kherson line, which you can see here, the blue one. And also the gray area would be given to the USSR, and the green area would be given to Poland, which was German territory. So Poland moving westwards and gaining territory from Germany. Provisional governments were to be organized in Poland, including democratic politicians. And then free elections in Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Romania, and Czechoslovakia. And also Declaration of Liberated Europe. Let's see, there we go. So agreements on how to deal with liberated Europe or defeated Eastern European countries. The agreement reached, which were accepted by Stalin, called for interim governmental authorities broadly representative of all democratic elements in the population, and the earliest possible establishment through free elections of governments responsive to the will of the people. So this is what the Liberated Europe stands for. And this was found in our book. So for example, the 3 governments will establish conditions or help people to establish conditions of internal peace, to carry out emergency measures, and also to form interim governmental authorities broadly representative of all democratic elements in the population, and to facilitate free elections of governments where needed. And this text of Liberated Europe was a key text upon which all future accusations of Soviet betrayal and bad faith were made. This was said by Martin Walker, because Stalin did not really conform to these rules, so tensions were created. So next up is the Potsdam Conference. The Potsdam Conference, it took place in 1945 in July and August. Stalin, Attlee, and Churchill participated. It was right after the testing of the atomic bomb, and Truman wanted this to happen after so that he could try to threaten Stalin and make Stalin make concessions in Eastern Europe. But it didn't affect Stalin in the way that Truman wanted it to, because Stalin also knew about this through spying, and the reaction was that Stalin also wanted the USSR to come up with this kind of weapon. So Poland, Germany, and the Council of Ministers were on the agenda. And this was the last time for the leaders to actually meet and collectively discuss cooperation in post-war reconstruction. So there were huge differences between Yalta and Potsdam. The issues were the same, but the goodwill to overcome them was gone because the countries no longer needed to stick together. And another quote, lack of a common enemy in Europe led to difficulties reaching consensus concerning post-war reconstruction on the European continent. So yeah, this pretty much explains the difference between the Yalta and Potsdam conferences. So what was agreed upon? For example, German demilitarization, denazification, punishments for war criminals, no military industry, democratic political parties were encouraged. And for example, also German education systems were to be purged of any authoritarian influences, and so on. Then they had some temporary compromise considering reparations. So the agreement was hard to reach, but they could compromise at last. So the USSR had suffered tremendous losses, so they wanted Germany and other Axis nations to pay. But the USSR and Britain believed that German economy must be left sufficiently strong so it could pay for imported food and raw materials itself, because the Allies did not want to pay that for Germany. And also the US did not want to repeat the mistakes of the Treaty of Versailles, as that handicapped the German economy and fueled the rise of the Nazis, and they didn't want that to happen again, of course. So a temporary compromise was reached. And that was that the different states could take reparations from their own German zones. And the Allied Control Council or Commission was formed. And the USSR did not want to be outvoted, so Stalin wanted each commander to have complete responsibility for his own zone, and this of course stopped the commission to have any real power. And then Council of Ministers was established to negotiate peace treaties with former Axis states, so with Finland, or for Finland, Bulgaria, Romania, Italy, and Hungary, and later on for Germany, but that didn't happen in a long time. And then not agreed upon. Much of German future considering political and economic measures. And the Morgenthau plan was not used. That was a Jew's plan. He wanted Germany to become an agricultural state, but this was where people were afraid of this leading to Germany becoming communist. So new plans were formed, being the Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine. And then what was followed up at Potsdam compared to the decisions taken at Yalta. So for example, Foundation for Coming Peace, because they organized a Council of Ministers. Then some plans for German future, and 4 occupational zones of Germany and Berlin, because they now agreed on boundaries between the zones. But then not followed up at Potsdam. So for example, instead of the Polish border running along the Curzon line, which I showed earlier, the USSR switched it to the Oder-Neisse line, because they were the ones occupying this zone, so the Western powers couldn't do much about it. And then liberated Europe didn't really work out because Stalin turned Eastern European countries communist. The Polish elections and government did not really go as planned either, because Stalin supported communist people in Poland, so there were no free elections and no democratic government. And then no free elections in Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, nor Romania, because non-communist parties were suppressed by Stalin. So a quote from Britannica. In any case, the Soviet Union was the military occupier of Eastern Europe at the war's end, and so there was little the Western democracies could do to enforce the promises made by Stalin at Yalta. Also, it was not a question of what we would let the Russians do, but what we could get the Russians to do. So here we can see the difference between the Western powers and the USSR. And for the last one, the Paris Peace Treaties. So they had very differing opinions on punishments on this when they negotiated the pieces or treaties from 1945 to 1947. So they argued about a year, for about a year. It was concluded in 1947. And the differing opinions were, for example, that the Soviets wanted to come up with harsh treaties for the Axis powers, while the Western powers wanted them to be a bit more chill. But peace treaties were created for Italy, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Finland. And the treaties allowed these countries to reassume their responsibilities as sovereign states in international affairs and to qualify for membership in the United Nations. No treaty was signed for Germany due to disagreements, so it was signed in 1990, and Japan got its treaty in 1951, Treaty of San Francisco. A quote, the political clauses stipulated that the signatories should take all measures necessary to secure to all persons under jurisdiction, without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion, the enjoyment of human rights and of the fundamental freedoms, including freedom of expression, of press and publication, of religious worship, of political opinion, and of public meeting. So this was, of course, a way to prevent something like Nazi Germany happening again and to value human rights. So briefly about the peace treaties. Italy lost a lot of territory and its old colonies. So lost colonies of Italian Libya and Italian East Africa. They had to pay $360 million as reparation, and controls were put on Italian armed forces. And then Romania, they lost some territory, as you can see in the picture, to USSR and Bulgaria, and $300,000 to the USSR. Then we have Bulgaria, had to pay $70,000 million to Greece and Yugoslavia. Also lost territory to Yugoslavia and Greece, and it was the only country to keep territory gained during World War II. Then Hungary, $300,000 million to the USSR, Yugoslavia, and Czechoslovakia, and loss of some territory. I didn't find any good pictures, but it wasn't much territory that they lost. And then Finland, $300,000 million to the USSR, borders of January 1941, except for Petsamo, so the red parts were lost to the USSR. And Finland did initially have support from the Allies, but it was lost due to cooperation with Nazi Germany. And then breeding ground for the Cold War. So the Red Army was the army to take Berlin. So USSR saw it as Soviet territory, which of course made them angry when the US and Britain wanted to have a part of it too. Disputes between the West and the USSR due to disagreements about different things. For example, economic and such. The Declaration of Liberated Europe was forgotten and disrespected by Stalin. And then, as I said, no decisions on how to govern Germany politically and economically. So this all led to tension between especially the US and the USSR. And in my opinion, the most important lesson is that the different conferences functioned as breeding ground for the Cold War, as they created tension between the Western powers and the USSR, mainly the US and the USSR. The tension was especially caused by the disagreements of how to govern Germany, but also other reasons, but especially on how to govern Germany. So that was it. I hope you learned something new. Thank you for watching.